As the introduction of the tensor operations has been rather theoretical, our exercise this time is to find the component expressions for the operations that we just defined. That is, find the component expressions for the tensor product, for the multiplication by a scalar, and for the contraction. Starting with the tensor product of the tensors t and s, we are looking for the component that has m1 plus m2 indices, and we label them a1 through am1 and b1 through bm2. By definition of how the tensor product works and how the components work, this is equal to t acting on the tangent basis vectors ea1 through eam1 multiplied by s acting on the tangent basis vectors eb1 through ebm2. Again, by the definition of the tensor components, this is equal to the product of the tensor components of t a1 through am1 multiplied by the tensor components of s b1 through bm2. For the multiplication of a scalar, so the components of the tensor k multiplied by t, which has m indices a1 through am, it is equal to k multiplied by the tensor t acting on the tangent basis vectors ea1 through eam. Again, by the definition of the tensor components, this is equal to k multiplied by the tensor components of t. Finally, for the 1-1 contraction of the tensor t, it is a type n-1 m-1 tensor, and therefore has n-1 contravariant indices and m-1 covariant indices. We call them a1 through an-1 and b1 through bm-1. By the definition of the contraction, this is equal to t acting on the basis tensor e, c, a1 through an-1, which is a type 0m tensor, and this tensor acts on the basis vectors ec, eb1 through ebm-1. But this, by definition, are the components of the type nm tensor t, where the first covariant and the first contravariant indices have been replaced by the same summation index, in this case c, and then we have the contravariant indices a1 through an-1 and the covariant indices b1 through bm-1. Generally, the first and second relations here hold also for type nm tensors. That is, if we have a tensor product between two different tensors, then the components of this new tensor are the product of the tensor components, and if we have multiplication of a tensor with a scalar, the components of the resulting tensor is the same scalar multiplied by the components of the original tensor.